All right, everyone, let's start. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming to this this year Nobel Prize in Economics lecture from IP Paris. I know it's confusing, but the actual Nobel Prize is not going to present. But it's going to be three presentations today on the contributions of Claudia Goldin, this year recipient for having advanced our understanding on women labor market outcomes. So Claudia Goldin is from Harvard University. And today we will have the pleasure to listen to three talks, one by Federica Meluzzi on the quiet revolution that transformed women's work, a second one by Roland Rathelot on the last chapter of the Grand Gender Convergence, and the last one by Sara Signorelli on the origins of the skill bias technological change. And so thanks a lot for coming. And so the floor is to Federica.
Et là, les slides, elles sont où? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for inviting me to contribute to this lecture. So before starting with the presentation, with my talk, I would like to cite some words from a paper of Claudia Goldin in 2005. Which is entitled From the Valley to the Summit. So these words were quite influential to me when I first read them when I was starting my PhD. So she says, throughout recorded history, individual women have reached summits. Until recently, however, the vast majority of women, even college graduates, occupied the valleys, not the summits. They had jobs, not careers. The only reason we can have a meaningful discussion today about women at the top is because a quiet revolution took place about 30 years ago. So she was saying these words in 2005. So this revolution she's talking about happened in the 70s. And these words were really influential and really motivated me to study gender differences in the labor market at the beginning of my PhD. So the title of my talk is The Quiet Revolution That Transformed Women's Work, that I'm borrowing from a paper that Claudia Goldin wrote in the American Economic Review in 2006. And I thought these words could introduce you to the topic of the quiet revolution that will be the center of this talk. So my name is Federica Meluzzi, and I'm a PhD student here in economics at CREST. I just finished my third year of PhD, and the focus of my work is in labor economics, and more specifically in gender differences in the labor market, especially from a job search behavior. So for me, for my thesis, Claudia Goldin was an inspiration both to my work as an economist and her work as an historian, but also even more potentially as a thinker and as an intellectual. So she's really one of my favorite role models in this profession, if I can say. And so let's start with the talk of today. So I think one of the reasons why Claudia Goldin became so interested in gender differences in the labor market was the recognition that the rise of women's involvement in the economy over the past century has been the most spectacular change in labor markets in the US and in all OECD countries. And in fact, from a paper in 2006, she says, it would not be much of an exaggeration to claim that women gave birth to modern labor economics, especially labor supply. Economists need variance to analyze changes in behavioral responses, and women provided an abundance of that. Men, by and large, were not as interesting, since their participation and hours of work varied far less in cross-section and over time. So to introduce briefly Claudia Goldin, she is a labor economist and an economic historian that combined these two sets of skills to provide two broad and groundbreaking contributions to our understanding of gender differences in the labor market. So first of all, she provides many novel facts on women's labor market outcomes. And then she combined these novel facts with a coherent economic framework to identify causes of change, as well as the main determinants of the residual gaps in the labor market in more recent decades. And so the goal of my talk is to focus on the historical evolution of women's involvement in the economy, and then Roland will follow and we'll talk more about the residual gaps in the labor market today. So I was saying that the increased involvement of women in the economy was the most remarkable change in labor markets over the past century. And I think this graph can be a proof of this statement. So this is from a paper in 2006, where she is plotting the labor force participation of men in blue and of women in green and pink. And what you can immediately observe is that the labor force participation of men is roughly stable and very high over the entire century, while the female labor force participation undergoes this steady increase from very low levels starting in 1890 until more recent decades. So if you look, for example, at the pink line, which is the labor force participation of married women, you see that this was starting from less than 5% in 1890, and then it climbed to more than 75% in 2000. And then one of the main contributions of the work of Claudia Goldin was to understand that the modern economic roles of women have emerged in the US in 4 distinct phases that I'm sketching here in this graph. So the first 3 phases spanned 80 years, from 1890 to 1970. And she termed these phases as evolutionary, and we will see why. And then suddenly, around 1970, there was this quiet revolution that is widespread in many of her works. And we see signs of this revolution in many social indicators that we will see during the talk. So in many of her papers, she makes a clear distinction between evolutionary and revolutionary changes. And she says that this distinction is not a mild one. And the main reasons is that over this century, many factors have contributed to the increased involvement of women in the labor market. But what was common of the first 3 phases is that all of the changes that happened were not under the control of women. So all of these changes happened because of exogenous factors, such as changes in demand-side factors or in the institutions in which women were living at the time. And so some of these changes, for example, have to do with the structural transformation of the economy that gradually made more available nicer jobs to women, or the institution of scheduled part-time jobs, the abolishment of marriage bars that were, for example, laws that were prohibiting the employment of married women in some of these decades, and also the diffusion, for example, of household technologies that decreased the cost of working for women. And so all of this exogenous change were also coupled with a decrease in the social stigma that was surrounding working wives at the time, and we will see why this was relevant. And so what was common of these 3 phases is that all the changes were visible fully and only in the labor force participation of women. And then suddenly, starting from the 1970s, there was a revolution. So women became active actors. So all of the change that happened after the 1970s was due to the choice of women. And 2 main elements were changing at the time. One was that women gained horizon. So until now, all of the choices they were doing were in a static fashion. So they didn't anticipate that their working lives would have differed, for example, from that of their mothers. And so they didn't invest enough in human capital accumulation and so on. And the second important change was that of identity. So the work and occupation of a woman started to be part and to define her social identity. And so women, starting from the 70s, were not only working because they had to provide for family income, but also because they wanted to work, because they were gaining utility from the identity connected to working. And so what is new about this revolution is that we can see many breaks and many changes in a variety of social indicators well beyond the female labor force participation. So before detailing the 4 phases or the 3 phases that led to the quiet revolution, I think it's useful to provide an overview of what was the working situation of women at the beginning of the century. So in 1890, only 19% of all women were in the labor force. And the social norm at the time was that women were exiting the labor force at the time of marriage. So only 5% of all married women were working in these years, against 40% of women, of single women that were working. And when considering the nature of jobs at the time, most jobs for women were in the manufacturing sector, where women were employed as piece workers, especially in the textile industries. Most of them are employed also in agriculture and in domestic services. And so we need to consider that the nature of the job was of dirty, dangerous jobs and jobs with long hours. And so due to this dirty nature of jobs, there was high social stigma towards husbands that let their wives work for pay in the labor market. Because the fact that women were working in such dangerous occupation was a clear signal that the husband had failed to provide for family income. And so this was an important factor in preventing, especially married women, to work. And this was related to the fact that because of the social stigma, women were very elastic to their husband's income. And in fact, this is reflected in the fact that if we look at the distribution of education in subgroups of the population, we see that those women who were in the labor force at the time were less educated than the population average. So this was the situation also at the very beginning of phase one that spanned 4 decades from 1890 to 1930. And then starting from the half of this phase, there were 2 important changes. So one of them had to do with demand side factors. So due to the diffusion of new information technology, there was an increase in the demand for specific occupations such as office workers and clerical workers, which made available suddenly nicer jobs to women. And then the second change was a big expansion in high school institutions between 1910 and 1930, which of course led to an expansion in high school graduation rates, even for women, and so an increase in the supply of more educated female workers. And so these 2 factors contributed to an increase, quite a mild increase in female labor force participation over these 4 decades by 9 percentage points on average and by 7 percentage points when only looking at married women. And we need to keep in mind that in this phase, the social stigma was still very high. And so women were not very elastic to their own wage. So they didn't not respond much to these increases in the demand, whereas they were very elastic still to the husband's income. And then something began to change, especially in phase 2, that was really dense in terms of transformations. So some of them had to do with the nature of jobs. So nicer jobs were even more available in the economy and so for women too. And so women had now the possibility to enter these nicer jobs prior to marriage, and some of them stayed employed in these more respectable jobs even after marriage. And then in 1940, there was the creation of scheduled part-time work that led to an increase in the magnitude of the substitution effect. So now women had the opportunity to work in the labor market fewer hours relative to what was possible before. On the other side, due to the fact that more educated women were now entering the labor market, the social stigma also went down. So it was socially more acceptable for women, even married women, to be in the labor force. And this led to a decrease in the magnitude of the elasticity of women relative to the husband's income. And then other obstacles that have been important until that moment to prevent women from working also were abolished. So one important one was that, especially in the 30s, marriage bars were very prevalent in many US states. And these were laws that prohibited the employment of married women. So most of them were eliminated by 1940. And then also around the same time, there was a widespread diffusion of household technologies, such as the washing machine, that basically was widespread in almost all households, that then reduced the cost of working for women. And so all of these changes altogether, together with a decrease in the social stigma, led to a substantial increase in the labor force participation of married women by 16 percentage points in this phase. And then phase 3 was basically characterized by an important surge in the demand for workers, which for the first time met a very elastic labor supply of women. And these 2 elements drove quite an important increase in the labor supply, especially of married women, from 25 to 46%. But so until that moment, it's important to keep in mind that women were still passive actors. So all of these changes happened, but they caught these women by surprise. They were not prepared. Their expectations were still of intermittent career, not of continuous ones. So women at this time were not investing as much as men in their education, both on the job and, for example, at university. But things began to change exactly in 1970. And this is what she called the quiet revolution, or a revolution from jobs to careers. So we can see signs of this revolution in almost all social indicators that are available for that time. 2 here refer to the human capital investments of women. So what we see, for example, on the graph on the left, is the difference in the attendance rate, in the college attendance rate and in the graduation rate of college for men minus women. So what we can see is that the gender gap in college attendance was roughly stable and close to zero for both cohorts between 1980 and 1910. And then it started to decrease until those born in 1950. So in those years, less women than men were going to college. And then suddenly, for the first generation of women that were born in the 1950s, so that were 20 in the 1970s, we see a stark and very sudden increase in the college education of women. And in just 5 years, this gap reverted, and more women than men started to go to college. And this is the case also in all OECD countries today. And so what we see here is that the change was sudden in 1970. And the same can be said if one looks at the distribution across majors between men and women. So what I'm showing on the right is a graph again from the paper in 2006. So this is the fraction of women that entered different types of professional school, such as medicine, law, dentistry, and MBAs. So what we see is that the representation of women in these programs before 1970 was very low. And then it suddenly started to increase from the 1970s up to parity around 2000. So the college major choices of women were more similar to those of men around these years. And then these changes were also reflected in the types of occupations women were starting to work in the same years. So again, starting from the 70s, there was a break in the types of occupation women were working. And in particular, the fraction of women working in traditionally female-dominated occupations, such as teachers, nurses, or social workers, started to decrease in favor of a higher representation of women in non-traditional occupations for women at the time, such as doctors, professors, managers, among others. And so this, of course, was coherent with the change in the college majors and the types of programs women were entering in. And then some important change can also be seen in one important demographic element, which is the median age at first marriage for women. Which is here shown for college graduates and for non-college women. And so if we look, for example, at the graph, at the line in blue, which is that for college women, what we can see is that for birth cohorts before 1950, the median age at first marriage was quite stable, around 22.5 years. And then it suddenly increased, again, very sharply, around 1970, up to 25. So there was this very sudden increase in the age at first marriage that happened in a very short amount of time. So you can see also in the paper changes in basically all of the indicators we can think of that are measurable for those years. And then the question is, what happened? And so Claudia Goldin devoted a lot of work trying to understand what drove this revolution. And something happened that basically changed women's horizons and identity. So for the first time in the 70s, women gained horizon. So to show what she means by that, she's using data from the National Longitudinal Survey, which is a survey that asks female teenagers between 14 and 24 their beliefs about their labor force participation when they would be 35. And if you look at the answers, for example, 1968, which is the bottom dot in the graph, you see that only 33% of women from different ages were answering that they would be working when they were 35. And there was a strong misperception of these women relative to the truth for them, because for that generation, the actual labor force participation would be rather 65%. Whereas their answers were mirroring what was the working situation of their mothers, so the current situation. So they were not able to correctly anticipate what their working career would look like. And so they were not prepared to invest in their human capital, in their education, and so on. Whereas also in this case, there is this sharp break after the 1970s, and for a decade, there is this continuous increase in women's expectations, up to the point that in 1980, 80% of women said that they would have been working by the age of 35. So a sharp increase from 33 to 80% in just one decade. And so expectations of women became now more in line with the current situation in their future, because for that generation, 75% of women would be working. So if anything, they were overstating this probability. And so, of course, the fact that they form now more accurate expectations on what their working life would look like meant that they were preparing for their careers. So they became active actors in the sense that they decided for the human capital, they invested more in college education and in major choices that were more in line with their talent. And then a second meaningful change was the one of their identities. So for the first time, starting from the 1970s, the job, the occupation of a woman started to define her fundamental identity. And this is what we can see here using data from a survey that was done to many students from several colleges in the US over time. And so students here are asked to rank the factors that contribute the most to their personal satisfaction. And what she's plotting on this graph is the difference in the score given to each of these attributes by men minus women. So positive values here mean that men were valuing these attributes more than women. And what we can see also in this case is that starting from the 70s, this gap in the evaluation of attributes narrows between men and women now start to give more weight to their financial success and to their peers' recognition relative to men, and to give less importance to the family relative to men, up to the fact that the gap in the valuation of family basically goes to zero over time. And so this change in identity was very important because it drove down, again, for the first time, the substitution effect. So women now became less elastic, again, to their own wages due to the fact that they became stickier in their labor force attachment because they were deriving utility from being employed. So of course, leaving the labor force now was a source of a loss of identity. And so again, the question then is again, what caused the revolution? And Claudia Goldin did a lot of research and a lot of work to try and understand the fundamental causes of this revolution. She was an investigator and she collected many clues, and among them, the most important are two. So she realized that all of these changes were sudden, were episodic rather than continuous, and an answer to this question had to be looked for in some factors that also changed discontinuously around the same age. And so she considered many possible and competing explanations. And one of the most convincing is that one of the main factors that drove this quiet revolution was a critical innovation as tiny as a pill, as she defined it in the Nobel lecture she gave in December. And so one needs to consider here that before 1960, so in those ages there before the revolution, women didn't have reliable and female-controlled ways of controlling for their fertility. And so investing in a career or going to university was very costly for a woman because it basically meant to abstain from sex or a high uncertainty because being pregnant during college would have meant to leave college. And so the introduction of the pill just lowered this very important cost of investing in human capital and in university. And so in 1960, the pill was introduced in the US, but in the first period, it was only available to married women. And this was because the prescription of the contraceptive pill was not legal for minors without parental consent. And the age of majority at the time was 21 years old in most US states. And then something happened between 1969 and 1974. And in basically all US states, there were laws that were gradually implemented to reduce the age of majority from 21 to 18 years old in most of the states, and also to adopt mature minors doctrines. So now the pill was also available to minors without parental consent. And what is important here is that these changes were exogenous to women's demand and to women's involvement in the labor market. And the reason is that these changes between 1969 and 1974 were mainly brought about agitation during the Vietnam War and people asking for the right to vote. And so this is why Goldin and Katz are using these changes across states in the US that happened in a staggered way to measure and assess the causal impact of the introduction of the pill on the quiet revolution. And their findings show that the pill was very important in driving the quiet revolution in that it altered and increased the age at first marriage of women, and also it led to a higher representation of women into professional schools, as we saw before, and into professional occupations. I'm done with the presentation. I thank you a lot for your attention, and I leave the word to Roland that will continue with the story. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Federica. Maybe we have time, we have 5 minutes if there are a few questions. So I have one actually. So many things you showed were US data, right? So I suppose this stuff have been done in many countries. So is there any interesting heterogeneity in countries or things that could, so for instance, the pill effect, I suppose we can test it across countries too, I suppose the dates, is it the same in all countries, and do we find this similar increase?
So on that, I can briefly comment. So actually, yes, of course, these studies have been expanded in many countries. So this story is valid for the US. In other countries, it's even a bit different and so on. Regarding the study on the pill per se, so most of the work of Claudia Goldin, especially on this regard, is on the US. So I focused on that. Regarding the pill, actually, I don't know the literature that much. So I guess I have no clue if there are other studies from other countries on the same topic. For sure, she didn't, for what I know, contributed much on this. I don't know if you know something. I'm sorry. Yeah. No, but yeah. Yeah, but I'm not. Yeah, I'm not aware of. Sorry.
Okay, thanks a lot, Federica. And then we go for second speaker, Roland.
Thank you. Should be better. All right. So thanks a lot for including me in this program. I mean, I'm very happy to be here celebrating Claudia Goldin's prize. She's been very influential, making gender economics, a valued field in economics, and also gender issues are very central nowadays to into the broader field of labor economics. And so we also owe that to her I mean, among others. So after Federica's brilliant talk, I mean, I'm just going to focus now on the last bit of the last chapter of this history of the gaps between women and men, or maybe that is the last chapter that we know by now, because there is probably something to be written later. Here, I think the last chapter is going to be really about the fact that, as Federica showed, there was really an improvement, a notable improvement over the 20th century. Women by now are more educated than men in all countries, basically, that we know of. I mean, at least developed countries. However, we see this deceleration at the end of the series, right? So we see that all these improvements, instead of a complete convergence, has led to a remaining gap. And so the question that stays here is really which are the factors that are explaining these remaining differentials between women and men, and which policies should we design in order to close these gaps. And so again, in this particular case, Goldin took a hat, the dog, and the file closet, and started to work as both combining the tools of the economic historian and the labor economist in order to look for clues of what happened. And looking for clues means two things: accumulated new empirical evidence, and then trying all the different theories to see which theories fit better the data. So let's go back to this curve, right? So this curve is the labor force participation. The thing I was interested in while preparing this lecture was to see whether it would hold in France as well. What do you think? Well, kind of. So if you look at, so here, this is 1950 to, well, virtually 2022. If you look at the labor force participation of women in the US and in France, so in green, you have the curve that's come from the ILO from the US. And then you have a series of, because I didn't find any consistent curve for France, so I combined three ones. One that is on ILO, which is the red one. The one by INSEE is the blue one. And then there is one that I kind of made myself out of a paper version, which is the one by Marchand and Tello, which I numerized a little bit to see, and that's the violet one. So in a sense, you see that one thing with France is that women were actually participating much more than American women in the 60s. That's one first thing. So the convergence has been much less drastic between, say, the 50s and nowadays. The second thing is that the US seemed to have had a max or something like that just before year 2000, whereas in France it was much lower. So because convergence was really much slower than in the US, and also it was kind of continuous, so it didn't stop really that much. So what happened? So let's dive a little bit into that. So now instead of the, so the graph before was on the 1564. The one I'm going to show you now is just starting in 1980 and going until nowadays, and it's only on the 25 to 49 population. So the population that is really the core of the labor market. And here you see in blue males and in red females. Okay, so what you see is that there is indeed this convergence, and the convergence between men and women goes both because men slightly over time reduce the labor force participation, and that's kind of a long-term phenomenon. And also that you observe now on this subpopulation of the 29 to 49, you observe this deceleration as well as maybe even a decrease at the end of the period. So it looks like really what happens was really something on this subpopulation of the 29 to 49. If you look not now on labor force participation, but you switch to employment, you see pretty much the same story. So it doesn't seem to be really something that is on the unemployment margin, even though there is a little bit of that. So in a sense here, if you look at employment, you find that it has narrowed even more. So both because women increased more their employment than men did over the period, but really because men's employment has been decreasing even more than the labor force participation of the period. So there is a deceleration on that population clearly. So other things that are interesting to kind of look into is that it was not that the type of work that women and men over the period would be similar. And in particular, you see this huge phenomenon of the share of part-time work that is predominantly, at least at the beginning of the period, so say in 1980, it's only a woman's thing, okay? So 0 for men, something like 18% for women participating at that point. And then this difference actually increased over the period. So the fact that women were entering more the labor market was not entering necessarily in full-time jobs. And you see here not a deceleration, but actually a divergence between women and men in terms of the share of working part-time versus full-time. So this is something to keep in mind. The silver lining is that by the end of the period, if anything, you see things are actually converging again. So since 2010 and up to 2020, you see that there is actually a decrease in the share of part-time work, but the gap is still very substantial to close. Now, another one that's interesting is that you have series that are not very long. So I looked for a series on wages to try to have like a long-term view of the evolution of wages between women and men in France. What I ended up with was this one. So focusing, so here again, sorry, the x-axis is changing pretty much every plot, right? But so here in this case, we start in 95 and towards nowadays. What you find is that here what I plot is the ratio between the woman's wage and the men's wage, but it's a full-time equivalent wage, okay? So it corrects for differences in the number of hours worked, and it also corrects for the number of days worked during the year, okay? So you should think of really the hourly wage if you want. It's not exactly that, but it's similar to that. And here, the different curves, they relate to different age groups, okay? So what you see here, so here it's a little bit difficult to see because on the x-axis, you have the year of observation, and on the y-axis, on the different colors, you have the age. So the differences could be, of course, differences due to age or differences due to cohorts, right? But here, what you see very clearly is that if you look at the red curve, you see the women and men less than 26. You see virtually, I mean, your difference, but the difference is always between 0 and 5%, basically, in terms of wages. And that's since 1995. So it's not something that got better over time. It's kind of like the same thing. While if you look at the more like 26 to 30, 31, 40, 41, 50, and 51, 60, you see that you slowly go down and increase the divergence in terms of wages. Well, actually, the gap in wages actually the gap in wages was reduced over time. So you got some kind of convergence over this particular variable, but it's still also very substantial. So for sure, you have still a lot of differences even nowadays on terms of wages, but this is due pretty much, it's proportional to the age of the woman versus the man, okay? So you have this very interesting pact. So maybe this is good because maybe that means if it's a cohort effect, that means that it will continue to be washed, but it could be also an age effect. And of course, the literature on the child penalty shows that there is a very strong age effect. Okay, so the clue gathered by Goldin, if we kind of gather all this, is that you have also relative earnings of women that increased less for college graduates in the recent decades. And that's also very worrying in a sense. What she also shows is that the relative earnings of women, especially the college grads, decrease with age for each cohort, which is kind of what we showed a little bit here. Then you had the fact that the gender wage gap within occupation differs a lot by sector and occupation in a way that is kind of related to the prevalence of a few factors that characterize the job in particular. And so she uses data from the data set called ONET, which is basically a survey describing each jobs in the US in particular, but we have that also, we have these kind of things in Europe as well. And in particular, you can say, for instance, this job is higher in terms of time pressure, is higher content of contact with others, maintaining relationships with customers or with colleagues, structured versus unstructured, freedom to make decisions. And what she finds is that the gender gap varies depending on the content of the job, in particular along these dimensions. She comes up with something which is called the flexibility hypothesis, which is that down the line, these differences across jobs could mean that could lead to maintain the gaps between women and men in terms of earnings. Why? Well, I guess the model that is developed as well in the paper. So if you really want details on that, there is the paper published in 2014 by Goldin solo. And basically she introduces the fact that there might be, you could think that there are two jobs. So of course, this is just an illustrative model. You should think that in the economy, there is pretty much a continuum in terms of these flexibility things. But basically think that there are two kinds of jobs. And these jobs vary in terms of how much flexible they are. And what that means is that if you take the blue curve, this is the kind of job where the marginal returns to working an extra hour increases with the number of hours. So essentially, if you work a lot in these jobs, you have very high returns. Whereas if you work less hours in these jobs, you have much lower returns. In contrast to that, you have the jobs that are basically the red jobs, which is, well, you know, an hour is an hour. If you work 1 hour, if you work 35 hours or 70 hours, the extra hour basically rewards you in the same way. Okay, so you have these two kinds of jobs, and you could put labels on that just to make it more, you know, a little bit better. So what the cases she studies in that particular article are, for instance, for the blue jobs, you could think about lawyers, for instance. That's one of the cases she comes up with. But of course, you could think about CEOs or things like that. For the red ones, you could think in terms of people working in pharmacies, right? Pharmacists, I guess, yeah. Pharmacists. So is it pharmacist? Yeah. I don't know, it sounded weird. But, so you could think about pharmacists, for instance. And in this case, I mean, she tries to study what led these different occupations to have this kind of wage schedules. Why? And she says, well, in one case, there is a huge personification of the job. So a lawyer is really one person. You really want to work with this particular lawyer and not the other lawyer. Whereas a pharmacist basically try to equalize a little bit the task and make the different people working in the pharmacy substitutable in a sense. And that makes that you can divide the way you want the load of the work across the different pharmacies that work for this particular company. Whereas for lawyers, well, maybe you want this particular lawyer who is highly specialized in this particular kind of cases. For lawyers, there is the fantastic paper by Azmat and Ghazala and Rosa Ferreira, which basically look exactly at the career of young lawyers, women and men, and finds that even though they graduate from the same exact majors and universities and tend to start with exactly the same wage, there is very quickly a divergence between the wages of women and men in this particular occupation as they have children, basically, and as they start also diverging in terms of their working hours and in terms of also contacting new clients and things like that. So basically, you have the structure of the economy that could be conducive to having this kind of blue jobs, which are requiring basically to work 70 hours a week if you really want to earn a lot. And of course, this kind of design of the economy with a duality in the kind of jobs is going to generate also a duality in the roles that are assigned to different members. And whenever children come into the family, then there can be a specialization in terms of the tasks. Some people taking blue jobs and the other red jobs. And it turns out that women take the red jobs more often than men. So this is kind of the explanation. Of course, I encourage you to look at the paper itself, which is, as usual, with Goldin, beautifully written and super, just very nice to read, very differently from, I mean, most of the papers that at least I write. But it's true that it's very nice to kind of see this scholarly way to approach the problem. There's been a long offspring, of course. I mean, the field has become so huge that I don't want to kind of single out one paper or the other. But let's say that, for instance, there are two kind of very important pieces of the literature. One is about the child penalty, right? So it's really about saying, okay, so the story of Claudia Goldin is really that you need to have at the same time both this duality in terms of job offered by employers and the fact that women and men within the household specialize in these two kind of jobs. So that needs to be something that goes with children, and it's good to see what happens. So you have one of the key papers by Cleven, Landais, and Søgaard for Denmark. You also have a French paper, for instance, this one by Dominique Meurs and Pierre Porat, published in 2019, which really shows very drastically what happens, right? So you have at the top left, you have the evolution of the revenue, the total earnings for a woman in red and men in blue. And you see that whenever there is a children, well, actually men, if anything, as in the long run, they were actually earning more. So you see that there are no pre-trends actually. But then they actually carry on doing pretty well, and then even kind of doing even better. And you see that for women, it's kind of a drastic drop, and it's not converging back to zero at all. And you see that if you look into what is due to different things, it's actually a lot due to participation. So the fact that their activity goes to zero. The number of hours, even when they work, is reduced, and even the hourly wage is also decreasing, which might be going into the story of Claudia Goldin's flexibility hypothesis, because now you're also choosing jobs that are allowing you to have more freedom over your labor supply and the number of hours you work. So it could be other stories as well, but it's compatible with that story. So which policies, right? So the one that Claudia Goldin mentions in her paper and also in the talk that you mentioned, the December talk for the Nobel lecture, which really I encourage you to look at. It's 30 minutes, it's beautiful. And so first you need to have a combination, right? So you need more equity in the couple would play a big role, right? Because according to this story, it comes from the fact that then women and men start to do different kind of jobs, and that is coming from the fact that they have a different allocation in terms of how they care for children. But employers could also do their part in trying to offer jobs that are less often this kind of crazy explosive blue jobs that you had before. The issue is that it's not very easy to mandate that, right? So it's more trying to kind of understand how you can conduce this particular kind of changes. In the talk that during the lecture, she mentions that remote work can actually be good news in a sense that the explosion of remote work may have allowed to kind of segment more the task within the companies, and in turn lead to some blue jobs to be converted in red jobs in some way. So this is something that we will need to, I guess, monitor in the coming years to see that whether that helps or not. My last slide is going to be trying to understand a little bit what is the offspring, the offspring of the offspring. So what are where the research is going in this particular field, and how that may be changing the assessment we have also about the flexibility hypothesis. The first one, I really like this paper. It's really a working paper. It's called Who You're Gonna Call, and it's not Ghostbusters. It's really trying to kind of see who school principals are going to call when there is an issue with the kid in school. Okay, are they going to mechanically call for the mother, or are they going to call for the father? Well, guess what? they are much 40% more likely to call for the mothers. And so they try to kind of vary a little bit the thing. But that's what's interesting with this is that if you think in terms of a model, is that even if you think that there was couple equity, and if you think that employers were doing their part, there are lots of different institutions here and there that are there to going to slow down the convergence. Okay, and so it's very important that we pin down all these different institutions that are around and are going to be frictions towards convergence, even if there were couple equity and employers trying to go all on the red jobs. The second paper is very interesting as well, is a paper by Anderson and Emily Nix. It's trying to kind of look at the evidence from same-sex couples. And here the comparison is really what happens when there is a kid that comes in a household with a woman and a man, and one where you have two women. In particular, what's interesting there is that women in same-sex couple, they experience a lower total loss in terms of labor earnings. So if you look at the number of hours, like the cumulated number of hours worked, it's higher for the same-sex couples than the one that where there is a woman and a man, and there is a lower differential. So you see that if the story was everything about specializing between a blue job and a red job, you would somehow expect that, you know, it doesn't really matter whether inside the household it's a woman and a man, two men or two women. It should be specialization. One should choose the red job and the other the blue job. It looks more complicated than that from this paper. And then there is a paper by, which I really like, by A.B. Adams and her team about work on Amazon Mechanical Turk. I don't know if you know Amazon Mechanical Turk. It's an online platform where you can volunteer your work, and it's usually very small and short tasks. And you are doing that in repetition, in sequences, and you earn money on this website. It can be translation, it can be transcription, this kind of jobs, surveys. And what's interesting is that if you look at the composition of tasks made by women and men on Amazon Mechanical Turk, they do more or less the same kind of tasks. But women earn 20% less per hour, meaning that actually they take 20% more time to complete the same tasks. And why is that? So they tried to kind of ask they did surveys to try to understand what was going on. And what they ended up into was that women were more likely to interrupt their working time on the platform, in particular due to children. So women that are working from home, it doesn't mean that they are free from any kind of interruptions. So this is just to qualify or to try to understand whether we should place all our hopes on remote work, if remote work means having children at home by your side and potentially interrupting you. That shows that, you know, we should be very careful about this particular solution, or maybe it's not going to change everything. So we're not done yet. We are done with me, huh? But we're not done yet in terms of the convergence of the gender gaps or closing the gender gaps. And this is a fascinating field, and we should all work on this. And so thanks a lot for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Roland. Any questions for Roland? Okay. All right. Okay. So our next speaker is Sara Signorelli. Yeah. We'll talk about the skill bias technological.
All right. Can you hear me well? Great. Yeah. So this is the last part, and I'm gonna move away from all the amazing contribution of Claudia Goldin on the gender and labor field to talk about another labor-related topic to which she also made a great contribution. And this one is the one related to new technologies and which kind of skills are complementary to these new technologies. So before getting into the details, let's just think about the context. So this literature, she developed it starting in the beginning of the 90s. And the context at that time was really a context where you had two trends going hand in hand that might seem a little bit at odds or counterintuitive if you think about it at first. So the first one you see with the triangle is the relative supply of college skills. So here we're looking at men and women together. And basically what this shows is that over this period of time, from the 40s up until the beginning of the 2000s, there is a sharp rise in the share of college graduates. So the share of high-skilled workers in the labor force has been increasing steadily. And so if you're thinking about, Econ 101, demand and supply, you would expect that the relative wage of these college graduates would have been decreasing, right? So there is an increase in supply. You expect that the relative wage will go down. Actually, this is not what's happening. It's exactly the opposite. And especially if you focus on the period starting from the 80s, there is a very sharp rise in the college wage premium that goes hand in hand with this sharp rise in the relative supply of college graduates in the US. So you have at the same time more and more college graduates, and these people are earning more and more money. So why is that the case? And we have an academic debate that is very heated around that time, with different people putting forward different explanations that can explain these trends. So the first one is the one that tries to put the causes behind this phenomenon in the globalization trends. So basically there is globalization, there is a decline in low skill intensive manufacturing employment, and so this generates raising inequality in favor of high skilled workers. A second strand of the literature that started with the seminal work of Freeman focused more on the institutions and looked a little bit at what were the major institutional changes in the 80s, and pointing out the fact that there is a very clear and stark decline on unionization, and this decline on unionization might be responsible for the declining wages of relatively low-skilled workers, such as the blue-collar workers. And then finally, this very influential paper by Katz and Murphy in 1992 started up gigantic literature in the field of skill-biased technological change. So their argument was that the new technologies that were introduced in the 80s, and here we're thinking mainly at computers and robots, were disruptive, but at the same time, they were highly complementary to high-skilled workers. So basically, by introducing these new technologies, firms had a growing need for these high skills, such that the rise in the demand for these high skills was more important than the increase in the supply. And so that explains why you can have an increase in supply while at the same time an increase in the relative wage. And so where does Goldin comes into this picture? This is mainly work that she... Okay. Okay, let's try a bit more, otherwise I'll take the mic. Good. So what's Goldin's contribution? Well, she followed this seminal work by Katz and Murphy, but she adopted this approach that is very typical of her procedure, that by looking at history and really trying to look at the origins of things. And so the first question that she addresses is, well, okay, I do believe that technology that was introduced in the 80s is skill biased and is complementary to high skilled workers. Since when this is the case? So did all of the technologies introduced in the past, were they all skill biased, or basically depended, the skill bias emerged at some point in time? And then the second question that is asking is, given that we have different waves of skill bias technical change, was this always associated with a raising inequality between high skill and low skills? So is it necessary that when you have technologies that are introduced, that they are complementary to high skill, do we also always observe an increase in inequality? So as we have seen, her approach is really very linked to history as well. And what she does in her papers is also citing a lot of historical books and citations and trying really to look at the details of the different contexts. And so she says, okay, let us start with the first arguably a big technological shock of the modern era, which is the one of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. So we can think of this as the very first major technological shock that we have observed, at least in modern times, was this shock skill bias. So she goes and actually describes from this history book a little bit how this revolution was described. And so this is a citation saying that many of the major technological advances in the 19th century substituted physical capital, raw material, and unskilled labor for highly skilled artisans. So if we think about this period, basically we're moving from relatively skilled artisans that had their small shop. Here in the picture, you see the example of textiles, but this is also true in other kind of occupations. That's basically were substituted away by machinery and relatively lower skilled labor. So it seems that the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was the opposite of skill bias. So he substituted relatively high skilled labor with unskilled labor and a lot of machinery in factories. So it does seem that the skill bias was not always there. Next step is, okay, so she decided to look at different technological advances in the early 20th century, moving away a little bit from the main attention that had been given to the rise of assembly line in production, which developed in the 1920s, and going back to some technologies that were actually introduced a little bit earlier. And in particular, focusing on two revolutions that happened starting from the end of the 1890s. The first one, and I'll give you a description of that, because when I read this continuous and batch process methods, I had no idea what they were. So I'll show you a picture. But so this was actually a big change in the technology used in many type of goods, such as metals, but also liquids, and also different kind of food products that were relatively homogeneous, and that possibly made a difference in terms of the demand for different skills. And then at the same time, these new technologies were also combined with a switch in terms of the sources of energy, moving away from water-powered energy and steam towards use of electricity. So as I said, what are these batch and continuous technologies? They mostly relate to having basically a big container. For the batch manufacturing, all materials are charged before the start within the big container, and then at the end of the process, they are taken out. While for the continuous one is basically simultaneous. So with time going, you add material and then slowly the material comes out. For the first one is mostly for processing liquid, semi-solid, or gas, such as chemical, liquors, dairy products, while the second one is more for products that require a little assembly and have few moving parts, such as oats and canned foods. So you see that this kind of includes a lot of different products that potentially hire a lot of manufacturing workers during this time. And why do they focus on these two particular technologies, or why do they describe them in such details? Is because they can be thought of as the precursor of modern robotized assembly lines. Why? Because, well, you basically have these raw materials that you fed in to these big batches, and then the products emerge with very few hands intervening in the production. But there was the requirement for a team of mechanics and machinists that were able to attend the machinery and basically fix issues if there were issues. And so they require more capital. They rely more on electricity for their horsepower. And we might think, or their hypothesis was that this might have been the first technological shock that was skill-based. So that was complementary to relatively high-skilled workers. So that's her hypothesis based on the reading that she has of the historical papers related to these technologies. And so what she's asking is, let's bring this hypothesis to the data. Do we find evidence that these technologies are the first to be skill-biased? And then secondly, if we find evidence that they are skill-biased, were they associated with a raise in high school and college premium? So do we see a growing inequality following the introduction of these technologies? And so I'm going to show you two main tables that she has in her seminal papers. The first one is basically looking at the correlation across industries between the capital to labor ratio, so the capital intensity of the industry, both in the beginning of the century, in 1909 and 1919, and the share of high school graduates within these industries, and especially within the blue-collar occupation of these industries in 1940. So why in 1940? Well, because, and I'll say a few words about this later, but the data available for that period of time is not as good as we would wish it to be. And so, for instance, the share of high school workers was not available for the 1909 and the 1919 censuses. And so basically she's saying, okay, do we find a correlation between the industries that were more capital intensive during this period and the share of high school graduates? So do we see more skilled workers in industry that are more capital intensive? And across different specifications, they find that this is indeed the case. There is a positive coefficient. And then at the same time, there is also a positive association between the share of energy that comes from electricity and, again, the share of high-skilled workers or college graduates and high school graduates that are within this industry. So at least across industries, there seems to be a correlation. Obviously, this is not a causality. So the next thing that they try to do with this paper is to see whether this is true within industries if we look at changes over time. And so in this case, they cannot use this share of high school graduates because they don't have several points in time of observation. And so their new measure of high skill intensity is the share of non-production workers within the industry. So what they do in this table is to show that industries that had the biggest change in capital intensity, so between 1909 and 1919, they had the biggest growth in the share of capital out of labor. Do they also experience the largest change in share of non-production workers within the labor force? And that also seems to add up, and it seems to be to hold the test. So again, this seems to be relatively correlational. If we're thinking about studies nowadays, they try to have an identification that is more causal, but there are inherent challenges of researching the early 20th century. The data is very scarce. As you can see, they have it only one observation every 10 years. It's only available at the industry level and is limited in terms of the type of variables that you can find. So for instance, the education level of workers was only available in the 1940s and not in the two waves before. So the Goldin's approach is really to try to look at this correlational evidence, but then using different sources of data, and something I don't have time to introduce in this slide, but she has additional studies using the Iowa case. And the reason is that the Iowa state had a collection of high quality data for the time, and really focusing on that state where she can test a little bit more the hypothesis. So using different data sources, different methodologies, so cross-sectional evidence, panel evidence, trying to show that, well, we don't have a very perfect causal identification, but we have a bunch of clues and they all point in the same direction. And then what is really interesting and what is really also fascinating about reading her papers is that she also complements her data analysis with this careful historical facts that she takes from history books, and that are really compelling in a sense that they give you a very detailed description about the factors of the time and what were the major characteristics of the different periods. And so all in all, she builds a convincing case that technological change in the early 20th century started to be skill biased, while it was not the case before. So this early 20th century seems to be the beginning of the skill bias technical change, if we want. And so next question is, do we observe raising inequality that went hand in hand with this trend? And in particular, did college graduate premium kind of grew over the period, the same way as what was observed in the 80s? Well, the answer is actually no, not at all. So here you have 3 different lines, depending on whether we look at the premium for high school all men or premium only for young men from high school or college premium. And what we see is that actually the college premium or high school premium has been decreasing quite steadily over the beginning of the 20th century. So again, there is only a few data points, one at the beginning of the 19th century, and then the next one is in the 1940s, and then every 10 years after that. But still, the trend is very clear. The return to education has been decreasing over the period, despite the fact that she has compelling evidence that the new technologies adopted were actually skill biased. So why that is? And that relates to another strand of her literature of the period that really looks at the massive expansion of high school education in the US over the period. And when I say massive, it really means massive. So this is something that was really peculiar of the US and not only driven by economic factors, but really also, and she described it very well in a few of her papers, driven by really institutional decisions to build a lot of schools and to really try to educate as fast as possible, at least to the high school level, most of the American population. And so you see that this growth has been tremendous. So in the 19th century, or at the beginning of the 20th century, we had 10% of the population that was enrolling in high school. And basically by the 1940s, we're already around 70%. So a gigantic increase in the supply of high school graduates, which has been called the high school movement. And so her argument is that, well, in this case, the race between the supply and demand was actually won by the supply. So even though there was skill-biased technological change, the supply of high skill has been growing actually faster, and that's what drove the return to high school education down. And then what I find really fascinating, and this is something that she mentions, then she doesn't push to the limit, but she tries to make a comparison between this US leadership in education of the starting at the beginning of the 1900s and the economic dominance of the US in the 20th century. And so while Goldin and Katz as well acknowledge that multiple factors are behind the US economic dominance of the 20th century, and not least the effect of 2 world wars, they argue that it would appear logical that possibly a major part of the economic precedence of the United States came from its enormous lead in education. So the idea there is that this investment, massive investment in the education of the population was responsible or that contributed greatly to the economic success that the US met in the 20th century. And so this also opens up the question of which direction the causality goes. Is it technological change that raises the demand for different skills, and so people respond to that and they invest in education? Or is it the other way around? Is it because people are highly educated that different technologies can be adopted? And while they never take a definitive stand, they suggest in some of the work that the legacy of America's educational leadership was a technological dynamism that blossomed in the mid-century. So what she is basically suggesting is that this institutional decision to invest massively in education was maybe one of the causes that allowed the US to be very dynamic in terms of the different technologies that they were introducing later on. And with that, I would like to conclude just with a few strands of literature that bear the legacy of Goldin's work on skill-biased technological change and education. There are many others, but I'd like to focus on these 2 because I think there are 2 major ones. The first one is the burgeoning literature on routine biased technological change and the polarization of the labor market. So this literature basically took this idea that technological change is complementary to high-skilled workers and found out that most of the technologies that were introduced in the 80s, and again, computers and robots, they tended to be highly substitutable to routine type of tasks. So jobs that are very repetitive, and that this routine type of tasks tended to be not at the bottom of the wage distribution, but rather in the middle. So by replacing jobs that were in the middle and by complementing jobs that were at the top, that created a polarization of the labor market with more and more jobs at the top, more and more jobs at the very bottom that are manual jobs that are not easily substituted by technology, and creating basically a hole in the middle. And that was one of the reasons put forward also for the increase in wage inequality since the 80s. And again, this really was inspired by this idea of skill bias technological change that was introduced by Goldin together with others. And then if we think a little bit about the future of work and all of the debates that we're also encountering right now, there is this thinking about, okay, which type of skills are going to become obsolete, which type of jobs are going to be replaced by the current technologies and the future technologies. And there is an hypothesis that maybe the very recent technologies, the artificial intelligence technologies, for instance, might not be so skill biased, in a sense that they might start replacing some tasks that are actually done by high skilled workers. So there is this hypothesis that is still to be tested fully, that maybe some of these high skilled jobs are going to be replaced by the technologies that we're seeing emerging right now. And just to mention that this was a very prolific literature, and that the seminal paper on routine bias technological change by author Levy and Murnane was cited almost 9,000 times. So this is, if you Google on Google Scholar routine bias technological change, you're going to find hundreds of papers on this topic. And then a second strand of the literature, which I think was greatly also inspired by the work by Goldin, was the one on more of a macro literature on endogenous growth and directed technical change. So for instance, Aguillon and Violante's work. And there the idea is that indeed technological change is not exogenous, but that is more likely to take place in societies where the skills that are needed to introduce these innovations are widely available, and such that basically by investing in certain type of skills is also a way to invest in further innovation down the line, and that the type of research and development that the economy does might be directed at different factors and sectors depending on which one are the skills that are prevalent within the labor force. And so that indeed is not a one-way story where technology kind of falls from the sky and then there is a reaction from the labor force side. Is actually a mechanism that feeds itself, and potentially a positive spillover mechanism that you invest in the skills and then you have higher return later on that feeds into itself. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you very much.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Any questions on to everyone actually, because we are done. Yeah. Also.
So are there any bridges between the contribution and the one it's on the way maybe of experimenting?
Yes, so let's say she doesn't make a huge connection between the two, in a sense that in the papers that I've described in this strand of literature, she doesn't really distinguish much between men and women, but also because it's the beginning of the century, and so she mostly focuses on men because that's where the workers are at the beginning of the century. However, there are some papers much more recent that try to look at the interplay between the two, and in particular, showing that some of these routine jobs, and in particular in manufacturing, were highly male, And so that the replacement of these jobs, so the routine bias technical change, might have helped women in some sense by destroying jobs that men were doing. So it's not necessarily a good news overall, but it's relatively hurted men more than women. So there are papers that try to make the link between these two, and I think there is also more to be done in that direction.
Any other question? Okay, thanks a lot to all three speakers. That's great. Thanks. So we are closing.